Book I know on Christian hospitality, and it's a great discussion book. It's by Christine Pohl, P-O-H-L, and it's called Making Room, Recovering Hospitality as a Christian Tradition. Now, let me tell you a little bit about where this book fits in the literature. This comes as a part of a relatively new movement theologically in the American Protestant Church, an emphasis on practices. There was a realization a generation ago that, Catholics have rosaries, Jews have kosher kitchens and diets. What do we have that marks us off as a distinctive identity as Christians? And so in an attempt to recover those authentic things that we do together that constitute our Christian identity, this movement has started, and it's identified a number of practices, and hospitality is one of them. We're going to be looking at some biblical texts that may surprise us a little bit about hospitality. But before we get into the biblical text, in addition to the scriptures, some of the best teachers I've had in hospitality have been the ordinary saints who know how to practice it, and watching them do it. The first of these is Howard Montgomery, and Howard was a lay leader in Central Presbyterian Church in Atlanta, and he embodied the meekness that is described in Jesus' Beatitudes. I used to be condemned by the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, blessed are the meek, and so on and so forth. Like, I can't be all that. And then I was studying the Beatitudes in South Africa once, and suddenly it came to me. This was not written to individuals, this was written to the whole church, and spoken to a community, as South Africans are wont to create. And suddenly I heard the Beatitudes differently. Blessed is the community of faith that honors those who know how to peacemake. Blessed is the community of faith that honors those who hunger and thirst for justice and righteousness. It's talking about the whole church, and not all of us have all of those gifts, but we live in a community that honors them. Howard Montgomery had the gift of hospitality, and he was an usher at Central Presbyterian, and he wasn't just appointed. It wasn't the short straw, well, it's my week to usher. He was called to ushering. He had the gift of the spirit of ushering. For example, he could tell the difference when a visitor wanted to be rushed or a visitor wanted to be let alone. There is a difference, Some visitors want to sit on the back pew, some want to sit on the front pew. He could tell the difference and make people feel welcome. And part of the ministry of Central Church and part of the ministry of this church will be to identify who among you has that gift, how to honor that gift, cultivate it, reflect it. The other was Flora Miller. This comes from my youth. I grew up in Atlanta, and when I was a young teenager, the civil rights movement was beginning to flower in Atlanta. And one of the strategies being used by civil rights workers was that this sounds surprising today, but African Americans would simply show up at all white churches for worship. It precipitated a crisis. There they were. What will we do? Well, it happened to a church or two in Atlanta, and my church, which was a country Presbyterian church 16 miles outside of Atlanta, nobody would have ever found us. But our session decided they better get to work figuring out what were we going to do if the civil rights workers came to our church. Well, so important a decision was this, that at the end of worship one Sunday, the clerk of session made this announcement. He said, your session is meant to deliberate whether if civil rights workers come to our church, we will let them worship with us. And we have decided after much prayer and reflection that they will be admitted as long as there's room. We looked around, there were 75 empty pews like there always were. He went on to spell out the policy, and about 3 times he mentioned the phrase, as long as there is room, and suddenly it became clear there wasn't going to be any room. About the 3rd time he said it, Flora Miller, you remember her, she taught you 3rd grade Sunday school. She's about this tall. She wore a little pillbox hat and a mesh veil every Sunday to church. Flora Miller. She stood up and she said, "Mr. Clerk, if there isn't room, they can have my pew." Flora Miller understood the radical hospitality of the church because back in those days, what a church wanted to be known as was a friendly church. We're a very friendly church. But that's not the biblical principle. The biblical principle is not friendly church. The biblical principle is hospitality to the stranger. That's a different thing. To think of ourselves as a friendly church, when the SUV pulls up in the parking lot and the visitors get out, we think we could be friends with them. They're just like us. But hospitality to the stranger is God has sent us something not like ourselves. God is increasing our capacity for love and hospitality. And hospitality to the stranger is a more dangerous and radical act. After Flora Miller did that, we had another experience in our church. One Sunday morning while the preacher was preaching, suddenly in the back door of the church there came a man we'd never seen before. He made his way down the side aisle looking at us suspiciously. Who was this guy? We were on Highway 18 and we thought maybe he had hitchhiked. We were also beside the Southern Railroad tracks and maybe he had ridden the rods of a boxcar and gotten off. We don't know who he was, but he looked at us with darting eyes. We looked at him. The preacher stopped preaching for a minute and then picked the sermon back up. And we never found out because suddenly he bolted back and out the door and was gone. For weeks after that, those red clay farmer Presbyterians gathered under the pine trees after every service and tried to discuss what had happened to us. And they finally came to a Georgia farmer theological consensus. Jesus had sent us a stranger, and we had not done what we are called to do. We had not extended the hospitality of Jesus Christ. Now, they came to that on their own. They didn't even know about the hundreds and hundreds of year-old tradition in a liturgical document called the Didaskalia, which anticipates this very moment. It asks, "Church, if you were having the Lord's Supper and a stranger appears in your midst, and there's not enough food, and there's not enough room at the table, what would you do?" Answer, "You, O bishop, sit on the floor, that there may be room for the stranger. For you yourselves were once sojourners in a foreign land, and you must treat the sojourner as your friend and brother." The church has learned hospitality in powerful but difficult ways because it's strangers we're called to embrace, not just those who are friends. Now, I want to take a look at some biblical texts, and you've got a handout there. And the handout is sort of in canonical order, so I'm not going to look at them 1, 2, 3. I'm going to look at them as they come along. And the first one of these is the number third text. Yeah, I'll wait and let everybody get a handout. Acts 2. You'll sort of focus on Acts 2. Okay, I think everybody's got one. All right, this is the day of Pentecost. Listen to this report. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. And all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem, and at the sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they said, "Are not all these who were speaking Galileans? How is it that we hear, each of us in our own native language?" And then this sounds like a bus station announcer. Who was present at Pentecost? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, all aboard, please. There were Medes at Pentecost? Really? There hadn't been any Medes in the world for hundreds of years. They were as extinct as mastodons. There were Elamites at Pentecost. They didn't wander over from the next town, they wandered over from the Old Testament. To say that there were Medes and Elamites at Pentecost is like saying, you should have been at First Pres last Sunday. We had visitors from Florida, California, Illinois, a whole van load of Assyrians, and a cute little Hittite couple who signed the friendship pad. Do you know what this is saying? Everybody who ever lived was at Pentecost. The point I want to make here is twofold. One is hospitality, the inclusion of God's Spirit, is what theologians call an eschatological virtue, meaning this is something that we anticipate in the reign of God. And we have an early glimpse of it here at Pentecost. Here's another example of an eschatological virtue. You may remember a number of years ago when we were first learning how to speak in worship in inclusive language. We were stopping our practice of talking only in men language, man-male language, and stumbling our way forward with more inclusive forms, and we still are. And some people said that the reason we did this is because if you don't use inclusive language, some people will get their feelings hurt. Well, that's true, but that's not really the most important reason why we did that. Other people said it was a justice issue. That's true too. But even that wasn't the main reason we did this. The main reason we talked in inclusive language is because that's the way we're going to talk. When people come from east and west and north and south to sit down together at the table of God, in God's vision of a great banquet with all the family around it, we're going to talk in inclusive ways. And in worship, we're dress rehearsing. We're practicing the future right here. And in hospitality, we know we're going to fail at it. No church is as inclusive as it would like to be. But our attempts to embrace the diversity of humanity are practicing God's future. Everybody who ever lived will be there. The other thing is, it's not a gaseous inclusivity or hospitality. It's not, we're really hospitable if you're willing to come in here and be like us. Notice that everybody got to hear in their own language something of their particularity got preserved by hospitality as well. This is hard when we're trying to worship together. You know, I grew up in a Presbyterian church that likes to worship with 3 hymns and a prayer and nothing moves but the offering plates. Whereas some of my brothers and sisters like to worship where there's movement and activity and spontaneity and call and response. And part of hospitality is learning to compromise and to enjoy each other. I read a book called Good Taste, Bad Taste, and Christian Taste. And in it, the author described a Lutheran church that allowed an Hispanic congregation to use their second floor for their worship space. And when it came the first Christmas, the 2 congregations wanted to show each other how they had decorated their spaces. Well, the Lutheran congregation downstairs had a Christmas tree. Little tiny lights, beautiful little white Christmas, lovely. Upstairs, they had one of those mirrored balls like you have in a skating rink. And those big multicolored lights drooped all over the place. And the ones from upstairs who came downstairs said to themselves privately, "How boring." And the ones who went upstairs said, "How gaudy." But after that, they began to learn how to incorporate each other's styles into an inclusive kind of worship. Hospitality respects the particularity. Take a look at our second text, which is number 4, and we're back in James, our favorite epistle for today. And James is talking about ushering, okay? And he says this, my brothers and sisters, do you with your acts of favoritism really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? For if a person with gold rings and in fine clothes comes into your assembly, and a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in, and if you take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes and say, have a seat here, please, while the one who is poor you say, I stand here, sit at my feet, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Now, let me stop here to say, I used to read this passage and think he was talking to the kind of church I grew up in, where we liked doctors and lawyers to join our congregation. And so if a doctor or a lawyer came in, we would, oh, this is fantastic. The young new doc in town and his family have chosen our Presbyterian church. And a poor person, well, you know, there's a Baptist church down the road that probably would suit you better. But actually, let's read on as a little bit of a surprise in here. Listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom he has promised to those who love him? But you've dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you? In other words, James' congregation isn't rich looking for doctors. They're poor. And when they distinguish between the wealthy and the poor, they're favoring people who oppress them. Why are you doing that? The rich hire you and pay you poor wages, and then they accuse you of stealing their silver. They're the ones who drag you into court. Why are you honoring them? And then the biggest surprise of all, you are blaspheming the name that was spoken to you at the baptismal font. You are a child of God. Don't ever forget that. And that's the only status that's important. And when you start making worldly distinctions about money and so on, you're undermining your own baptism. Don't do that. Remember who you are, because that's the way in hospitality you can remember who they are. They're children of God first and foremost, not rich and poor. Now add to that a word that's in the next text in 1 Timothy 2. These are worship instructions, and hospitality enters into these instructions about worship. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. So also that the women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes, but good works as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. Now this is undoubtedly a controversial passage. And a lot of modern biblical critics say, this guy is so patriarchal. You know, he's got men praying, and then he's so frightened about women's sexuality, he wants them to knock off wearing the pearls and the braids and all those sexy garments that they wear to worship. But third world commentators have looked at this, and they see a different picture. First of all, in this community, the men have been relating to each other with their fists. They've been arguing about theology to the point of violence. And the writer of Timothy says to them, hey, listen, when you pray, don't pray like this. Pray like this. Notice the prayer posture. When you pray like this, you're not in the position of self-defense. You're in the position of welcoming the Spirit of God and also your brothers and sisters. And those undeveloped world commentators look at this word to the women, and they say, those women aren't trying to look sexy. They're trying to look rich. They're coming to church in their finest as if to parade their wealth in front of others and to make a distinction between those who can't dress like this. So the lesson I get here is that hospitality is a total matter of congregational life, not just welcoming the stranger, but welcoming the sister next to you, and not setting up arbitrary distinctions between you and them that would cut into the community of Christ. See, this is hard work, isn't it? To think through the many dimensions of hospitality that the gospel calls us to. But it does. It's a total concept. Mike Mather has been relocated by the Methodist Church, but he was until recently the pastor of the Broadway United Methodist Church in Indianapolis. And I invited him to the Emory campus one time to talk to pastors who were just beginning their ministries. And he knocked our socks off with one thing that he said. His church, by the way, had developed into a fantastically social outreach, a very generative congregation in a poor area of Indianapolis. And he said, we finally got to be a good church when we stopped trying to help people. We looked at him curiously. That sounds counterintuitive to us. And he said, oh, it's important. We have a clothing closet and we have a food pantry and all the things that you do. But that was what our whole ministry to the community was. And what that said to people when they came into the door is, we're interested in what you don't have. We're interested in what you lack. We're interested in what's wrong with you. And what we began to ask was not what's wrong with you, but what's right with you. What does your identity as a child of God bring with it? And the way we got at it was this. He said, we began to ask people, what's the one thing that you know how to do well enough to teach somebody else? And he said it was amazing how many people in the community had never been asked that, but had an answer to it. One woman, a Puerto Rican immigrant, said, well, I can cook. And they said, well, prove it to us. Here's $250. We've got a meeting of the officers next week. You cater it. And not only did she cater it, she catered it so well, the officers began to take her name and cell phone number to say, I've got a Civics Club meeting here coming up. And so they printed up business cards for her. She's got a great catering business in Indianapolis now, because this church was hospitable, not simply to what she didn't have, but hospitable to what she did have, what she did bring. Don't look at the artificial stuff. Are you rich or are you poor? What has God given you as a gift of the Spirit that you can use to help others, and we will help you do it. The next texts are text number 1 and text number 2, but I made a mistake. In trying to cut and paste, I cut and pasted the same text for text number 1 and text number 2. No problem, I'll tell you text number 2 rather than reading it. But text number 1 is Jesus' book of etiquette about hospitality, and here's what he says in Luke. He was at a dinner party, and when he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you're invited by someone to a wedding banquet, don't sit down at the place of honor in case somebody more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place, and then in disgrace you'd start to take the lowest place. But when you're invited, go sit at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher, and then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Lesson number 1 in this passage, it's not really about the etiquette of where you sit and looking at the place cards. It's the attitude that you bring to gatherings of people of faith. Do you bring pride or do you bring humility? And Jesus is encouraging that hospitality begins with those who come in with humility about themselves. And then that humility takes a radical turn. Let's move on in the passage. He also said to the one who had invited him, When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. You'll be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. It's even more radical than it sounds. Luke's theology is a theology of the great reversal. Here's what Luke thinks about the world. I don't know whether you have here in this part of Michigan malls that used to be fabulously wonderful malls, but now are on the decline. Well, we had them in Atlanta as well. It used to be that they were a place to go on Friday night if you had a date because there were theaters and restaurants and shoe shops and dress shops and people going through the mall and candy being sold, and they were delightful places to be. And now there are nail salons and tanning studios and vacant stores. That's what Luke thinks about the world, that it's still in business, but it has death written all over it. And so Luke's Jesus says, expect the day to come when the old order will ultimately die and the new order brought in by God will be born. And in the old order, people of status got to sit in the prestige seats at banquets. But guess what? In the new order, it's going to be the poor and the lame and the blind who are at seats of honor. Then he tells, and this is the one I meant to put in as Luke 16, this parable that has just confounded people for centuries. He says, there was a guy who found out that his chief executive, his manager, had been defrauding him. He calls the guy in, he says, what is this? You can't be my manager anymore. You're fired. Give me your company car. Give me your office keys. You're done here. The manager goes out and engages in a soliloquy. Oh, what am I going to do? My world is falling apart. I'm too proud to beg. I'm too weak to dig ditches. I'm unemployed. What? And then all of a sudden the light bulb goes on. I know what I'll do. What does he do? He runs around to all of the customers of his previous boss before they have heard the word and says, what's your account? How much do you owe my master? 100 bushels of wheat. Well, just cut that in half. Gift for me. He goes to all of the customers and he does deals with these. Well, that's the parable. And then Jesus says, and this just knocks people's socks off, I wish my disciples were as shrewd as that guy. That's the first thing he says. Does Jesus really want us to act like that guy? In a way, yes. The president and CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, gets up every morning figuring out ways to maximize Apple. I wish I had disciples that got up every morning and thought about ways to maximize hospitality, to maximize peace, to maximize justice. I wish my disciples were as energetic for the kingdom virtues as the world is for its. Then the second thing he said is even more outrageous. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to make friends for yourselves with unrighteous mammon so that when it fails, they may welcome you into their residences. What that sounds like Jesus is saying is, I want you to take drug money and make friends with it. I want you to take gambling profits and unrighteous mammon. I want you to no. That word in Greek, unrighteous mammon, actually means the money of the dying mall, the money of the dying world. In other words, the money I have in my wallet right now, the money I have in my bank account. For Jesus, that money is like Confederate money in 1862. It's the currently negotiable currency of a doomed sovereignty. You got a little shelf life on it, so what do you do with it? You go out and make friends, and we've already been told who those are. When you give a party, invite the poor and the lame and the blind. In other words, this is lavish hospitality on those who do not appear in the present context to deserve it, but in the kingdom context will be seated at the best seats at the table saying, Fred, thank you, you are my friend. Come, I've saved a place for you at the table of God. We had this church in Atlanta. It was a pretty conservative Presbyterian church. Central, where we went, was a pretty progressive Presbyterian church. This church, North Avenue, was more evangelical, but we loved each other. North Avenue loved Central, Central loved North Avenue. And one time the session of North Avenue was meeting, and the proposal on the table was a complete redo of the sanctuary. New pipe organ, new pews, redo of the chancel, the whole 9 yards, and the bill was going to be $10 million. One member of the session said, I move that we approve the $10 million if we also approve $10 million to care for the homeless. And somebody on the session said, John, that's $20 million total. We don't have $10 million for homeless people. So we have $10 million for us. Don't you think we ought to be like that woman who broke the precious ointment all over Jesus, even though it was very expensive? Isn't this ministry worth an investment? You bet it is, said Jesus. That's what I want you to do. Take the mammon of the unrighteous age and invest it in those who do not even know that they have been invited to the party yet. That's the kind of hospitality that the church engages in. The last text I want to look at, and then I'll see if you've got any questions or rebuttals, is Romans 16, and this is the dullest passage in the New Testament. No one has ever preached on Romans 16. I won't read the whole thing, it's so dull because it's almost time for your nap, and I don't want you to go into it too early. But Paul is greeting the congregation at Rome. And all it is a list of names. I'll give you a little bit of it. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, who work with me in Christ Jesus, and who risk their necks for my life, to whom I not only give thanks, but also the churches of the Gentiles. Greet the church in their house. Greet Epaenetus, who was the first convert in Asia for Christ. Greet Mary. Greet Andronicus, Junia, my relatives who were in prison with me, and so on. 26 names. That's the 16th chapter of Romans. Well, a very creative New Testament scholar by the name of Peter Lampa decided to take those names and act as if he were a kindergarten teacher getting her roll for the fall. If you're a kindergarten or an elementary school teacher and you get your roll before you meet your students, what do? You look at it and you guess. If you get Eduardo Rodriguez, you make a guess. If you get Tawana Wilson, you make a guess. If you get Alec Goldblum, you make a guess of who these people are going to be. Sometimes you guess wrong, but you make a guess about race and standing and so on. Well, he's looked at this list because in the first century world, names are even more indicative of social status and standing. And what does he find when he looks at that list? There are 26 names on there, 9 women and 17 men, but every now and then, beside a name is, who's really been a hard worker with me. Most of them are women. That's unusual in the first century, where the workers, the people who are really important to a social organization, are female in a mixed group. Every now and then he says, and also greet my relatives. This does not mean that Paul has cousins at Rome. That's in the Greek, that's who are Jews. And we've got a number of Jews in this list. 14 out of the 26 appear to be slaves. And 2/3 of them appear to have immigrant names. You see what the hospitality of God has done in an ordinary first century church? It's pulled together women and men, and the women are workers. It's pulled together Jews and Gentiles. It's pulled together slaves and free. It's pulled together Romans and immigrants. And there they all are. Greet them in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. The marvelous, inclusive group that the hospitality of God's Spirit has assembled in just one of the New Testament churches that we have in the book. As I say, you are, I can feel it, a hospitable group. It shows in how you greet strangers who are in your midst. And Kim and I are grateful for it. And we appreciate this opportunity to talk a little bit about the radical hospitality of God. I wonder if you've got any questions or comments you'd like to make in the last couple of minutes together. Anything you want to say? Yes, ma'am.
That word radical can sometimes have a negative connotation.
Yeah. Yeah, she's reminding me that I better be careful about using the word radical, because the word radical sometimes has a kind of a politically negative kind of capacity. And I confess I'm using it a little bit that way because I want us to, I think it's so important to get over the notion that Christian hospitality is really our best instincts writ large. You know, I'm a pretty nice guy, and so Christian hospitality is really, Tom, some days you're grouchy, but when you're at church, how about getting the best part of you out? Lead with your milk of kindness. You've got it, not every day, but well, it's more radical than that. It's a kindness that I would never think of, an openness that would, in fact, frightens me a little bit. And in fact, I think it is important to know, and Christine Pohl talks about this, that every Christian community that's tried to practice this hospitality has ended up hurt in some way, that we have limitations here. We are open to people who turn out to do damage to us. We are kind to people who end up being unkind to us. The pioneer of homeless ministries in Atlanta came to Central when Central opened its overnight shelter and said, I hope nobody burns your building down, but it is a risk. And we were scandalized. We thought we were being just nice Christians, kind to people on the street. He reminded us. Jesus risked his life and lost it, and this is risking the church's life. So I guess I'm using the word radical to kind of shake myself up a little bit, and if I brought the negative too much to bear, I apologize. It's a great point. Great point. Yes. Yeah, good. Whoever said that, I didn't say that, did I? I don't think I said that. That's a great comment. One last one, if you've got it. Yes.
Thank you for this session.
Yeah, sure.
I have a question about the degree to which practicing radical hospitality extends beyond the front doors of the church.
Yeah, yeah.
It's one thing to have a certain attitude or posture toward guests that choose to cross the threshold and join us in the church.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big threshold.
Yeah. Yeah. He's making an absolutely fantastic point, and he's talking about the distinction between hospitality that happens in here and then hospitality that happens toward those beyond the church. And I think I'm trying to describe this as a continuity, that the hospitality in here spills over into, and should spill over into, hospitality out there. But we are living in a particular age when that back wall right there is thicker and thicker. People don't move into communities now and say, let's try all the churches and see which one we like the best. And I think that means two things, basically, two umbrellas for us. First of all, I think we are in a time when it is clear that God is tearing down a lot of what we have in here in order that something more hospitable in community and to community might be born. None of us knows what's going to happen, but we feel that happening, that we're being reformed by the Spirit of God. And some experiments are going on. People are moving church into unusual locations, whether they be the lobbies of apartment buildings or taverns, or other places where people are not as afraid to cross that threshold. Some are wondering, I don't know what to make of this yet, it's too early, but some are wondering if God gave us this Zoom experience as a part of breaking down that wall. I talked to a pastor in Natchez, Mississippi at a Presbyterian church. He's got 90 members. He had 900 on Zoom. Now, that's a big court of the Gentiles, and those are people who wouldn't be willing to go inside, but who would be willing to turn on the computer to taste, experience. And so I think we're going to be rethinking some ways to get more out there. And then, in a very practical sense, can we make these walls more porous? I mean, what happens in here is still important. I met with a church in Cedar Rapids one time. The worship committee wanted to be more hospitable in worship. I said, great, let's go out in the parking lot and pretend like I've just driven up for the first time to the church. So I get out of my car and I walk toward the door of the church to go in, and they all stayed back there. He said, we haven't used that door since 1946. This is how we get into the church. Well, it didn't look that way to a visitor. And are there just physical barriers? Do you have your Howard Montgomerys out there saying to people who are kind of, dare we go in? Yeah, you dare go in. Are there ways that we can make the walls of the church more porous? And it's different in every place, but I think we're called to rethink that now. I've taken enough of your time today. Thanks for your graciousness in listening to me. I appreciate it very much.